You ever had one of those mornings where you think it's going to be quiet? Just you, your coffee, maybe the sound of birds in the trees, and then out of nowhere, your life feels like the opening scene of a courtroom drama? That was me, standing barefoot on my porch, coffee halfway to my lips, when my new neighbor stormed up my driveway before the sun was even up and yelled, "We'll seize your house by force if we have to." Now, I don't know how you handle things before breakfast, but me, I need at least 2 sips of caffeine before I can process a death threat on my own porch. I just stared at her, thinking, "Lady, I bought this farmhouse 3 days ago because it sits outside of your precious HOA boundaries. What on earth are you talking about?" Her name was Carol Sutton, self-proclaimed queen of the Willow Pines HOA, and she had 2 of her minions with her, wearing matching t-shirts that said Neighborhood Compliance Squad. They were holding clipboards like they were about to perform an exorcism on my property deed. I set my coffee down real calm and pulled out my phone, because if there's one thing I learned as a building inspector, it's this: document everything. Carol jabbed her finger at my front door and kept shouting about signatures from the previous owner that supposedly tied me to their subdivision rules. I held up my title binder and said, "Ma'am, I don't know what you're waving around, but this land has never been part of your HOA, and I've got the county records to prove it." That's when the cavalry showed up. A county deputy, young guy named Blake, rolled down the lane like he'd seen this circus before. He listened to her rant, flipped through her papers, and said flat out, "Ma'am, HOAs don't have seizure authority outside recorded declarations. What you're doing constitutes criminal threats." You could have heard the silence crack when he said that. Her minions started backing away, but Carol just hissed, "This isn't over." And she wasn't kidding. 2 days later, she switched tactics. I spotted her out my kitchen window, going door to door with a fresh clipboard, spinning a whole new story. Suddenly, I wasn't just a neighbor fixing up an old farmhouse. I was, according to her, some kind of outside investor threatening the valley's character. She had fake county documents, made-up statistics, even a logo for a rural preservation commission that doesn't exist. Some folks believed her. My elderly neighbor, Mrs. Hollis, who had just last week complimented my porch renovation, signed her petition like she'd seen a ghost. That stung more than her shouting. Lucky for me, Tom, the county records notary, happened to be nearby. He leaned in and whispered, "Those documents aren't real. Wrong fonts, wrong seal placement. That commission isn't even a thing." Right there, I realized this wasn't just HOA nonsense anymore. This was straight-up fraud. But Carol didn't stop with paperwork. A week later, she brought in muscle. 4 trucks pulled into my gravel driveway, blocking me in, and 6 people in matching inspection patrol shirts poured out with surveying gear, cameras, even orange cones. They started planting violation markers around my property, then pretending to discover them. One guy measured the distance from my chicken coop to the garden like it was a nuclear site. I watched from my porch thinking, "Are you kidding me?" Here's the kicker. The mail carrier pulled up mid-performance, watched them plant the markers, then caught the whole thing on her dashcam. Perfect evidence of staged violations. By the time Deputy Blake came back, their little show had turned into official harassment footage. Now, all this might sound bad enough, but Carol decided to go lower. She came after my livelihood. I run inspections for contractors across East Texas, and out of nowhere, my phone blew up with worried clients. "Hey, we heard you're under investigation for code violations at your own house. Is that true?" Turns out Carol had been calling around, spreading lies about me, even trying to bribe contractors to cut ties. What she didn't count on was Jimmy, one of my longtime partners, recording their call. She told him, "If you ditch Reed and use our people, there'll be more HOA contracts in it for you." That's not just gossip, that's bribery. And in Texas, that's a felony. At this point, I had videos, witness testimony, and financial records from my friend Rebecca, who dug into the HOA's books. And what she found was explosive. Carol had been siphoning HOA funds to pay those fake inspectors, hire lawyers, and bankroll her smear campaign. She was using her neighbor's money like it was her personal piggy bank. Still, she played one more card: legal warfare. She hired a big city attorney and filed for an emergency restraining order against me, claiming my farmhouse was a safety hazard. She even used the stage photos from her fake inspection team as evidence. The judge, cautious about public safety, granted a temporary order. Walking out of that courthouse with a restraining order on my own land, it felt like losing. But here's the twist. Rebecca traced the payment to that fancy lawyer and found Carol had pulled 12 grand straight out of the HOA's emergency reserve fund without board approval. That's theft. And not just petty theft. Felony-level misuse of nonprofit funds. When the local news got wind of the story, Carol saw an opportunity. She went on TV, painting herself as a community leader protecting property values. But the station ran a background check, as they always do, and dug up her past. Turns out, she had already been convicted years earlier for embezzling from another rural nonprofit. Same playbook, different town. The night the broadcast aired, my neighbors started knocking on my door, embarrassed and apologetic. Mrs. Hollis, the one who signed her petition, shook her head and said, "We had no idea she was a crook. I'm so sorry." The tide had turned. Then came the final act. Carol texted me early one morning, asking for a private meeting at the Overlook outside town. She wrote, "We need to resolve this quietly, before it escalates beyond everyone's control." Now, I'm not the type to fall for backroom deals, so I called the DA. They wired me up with a recorder, and I drove out there. She showed up right on time, sat down on the bench overlooking the valley, and slid a manila envelope my way. Inside was a cashier's check for 25 grand. "This is fair compensation," she said smoothly. "If you agree to drop everything and move away quietly." I almost laughed. Not because I was tempted, but because of how desperate she sounded. Then she kept talking, confessing to everything. She admitted creating fake HOA members, forging signatures, funneling money, even running the same scheme in other communities. I didn't have to ask questions. She spilled her guts like she believed she could charm me into silence. What she didn't know was that the DA's team was parked nearby, listening to every word. That recording became the nail in the coffin. A few weeks later, federal agents were in our valley. Charges stacked up like a bad poker hand. Wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, bribery, forgery, embezzlement. She's looking at more than a decade behind bars, plus restitution to every family she stole from. And me? My farmhouse is still standing, my business is stronger than ever, and my neighbors, well, we're healing. We've put in new bylaws, elected new leadership, and for the first time, this valley feels like a community again. But I'll tell you what, sitting on my porch with my coffee now, I think about how close I came to losing everything, not because of a storm or bad luck, but because one person decided her power trip was more important than honesty. And that makes me wonder, how many other communities out there are dealing with folks like her, using fear, fake paperwork, and neighbors' trust to get their way? So, here's my question to you. If this happened on your doorstep, if your neighbor tried to bully you with fake authority and even went after your job, would you fight back the way I did, or would you have packed up and left? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who's ever dealt with HOA drama or a crooked neighbor, and let's hear where you stand. Because sometimes the loudest voices aren't the strongest ones. They're just the ones who fall the hardest when the truth finally comes out.